Hi, everyone. Really happy to welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Tika Newton. I'm the Membership and Domestic Policy Manager for Climate Action Network Canada. We're joined by three lovely panelists here today. I'll introduce them in a moment. Our webinar today is looking at campaigns and initiatives that were run during the federal election campaign last fall. So we're looking at some of the best practices that came from the climate movement during last fall's federal election campaign. I'm joined today by Myran. He's the Executive Director of Future Majority. Future Majority is a Canadian nonpartisan organization working to unite the voice of youth across Canada. Is Future Majority's Executive Director and a founding member. Prior to starting in Future Majority, spent the last 10 years working in political and electoral organizing and technology in the United States. He was the Deputy Chief Technology Officer at a national political action organization, directing numerous election field campaigns, and he ran recruitment and training with the Green Corps, one of the top advocacy organizing training programs in the US. Will be talking to us today about how Future Majority used deep canvassing and tech to mobilize 25,000 students to vote, and it grew its membership base by 44,000 people. Our second speaker today will be Pottens. Works for GreenPAC, and he's the manager of the 100 Debates on the Environment. In the lead up to the 2019 election, GreenPAC and Equiterre coordinated 100 all-candidate debates on the environment in dozens of communities across Canada. As manager of the project, helped to ensure that the environment was an issue that no party or candidate could ignore. He spent over a decade at the cross-section of environment and government, working for multiple MPs in Parliament. Also spent 6 years running campaigns with Abreu, the world's foremost online advocacy network. He holds a master's degree in environmental studies. So will be presenting today about the 100 debates. And then finally, we're joined by our executive director here at CAN-Rac, Abreu, and she'll be walking through how CAN-Rac supported our 120 member organizations and allies to understand new changes in the Election Act and the CRA requirements in the lead up to the election. This was an election that broke the climate freeze and mobilized collective outreach of the network for a great success. And Catherine, as I mentioned, is our executive director. Climate Action Network is a coalition of more than 100 organizations, closer to 120 now, across the country to advance practical policies and frontline solutions to climate change. Catherine is an internationally recognized award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance transformative action on climate change. One of the world's 100 most influential people in climate policy, as named by Apolitical in 2019. She has over 15 years of experience campaigning on environmental issues, including 7 years in the heart of the global climate movement. So I'm very grateful to welcome everyone today. For those of you who are new to the Zoom platform, just a couple of quick notes on how to use the features here. If you hover your cursor over the screen and scroll to the bottom, you'll see there's a chat icon, and there's also a Q&A icon. You can post questions in either of those features. So just click on chat and type your question into the chat box, or type it into the question and answer box. We'll have presentations from the three panelists to start, and then we'll do questions and answers at the end. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron.
Hey, can folks hear me?
Yep, sounds good.
Great.
Thanks, Aaron.
Okay, great. I'm gonna, first off, I apologize if I'm coughing. I have quite bad asthma. And so it's, with everything going on with Corona, everyone's giving me a look, making sure we're okay. But this time of year, I have a lot of, I tend to just cough a lot because of allergies. So I apologize in advance. Let me share my screen. So folks should be able to see the presentation. I'm really excited to talk about the work that Future Majority did during the last federal election. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a real quick intro about what Future Majority is. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on our election plan, but then I'm going to really spend most of the time talking about the tactics, what we did tactically to turn folks out to vote. And then at the end, happy to answer any questions. I think we're going to do that at the end. Big picture, Future Majority, we're a new nonpartisan organization. We are, I think we're about a year old since it was folks other than just me in the organization, but our entire reason to exist is that we have a really rapid rapidly closing window to address the climate crisis, just 10 years. And we're clearly not doing enough from a policy and action perspective from government and business and our leaders to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And so for us, we were thinking about what can we do as an organization to ensure that climate change is prioritized as much as possible going forward in Canada. And specifically, we work with young Canadians because one, in this last election, young Canadians were the largest voting bloc. So millennials and Gen Zs, who make up 38% of the electorate, pretty much 9 out of 10 of us want to see serious action or greater on climate change, but only 4 out of 10 young Canadians are voting. And there's lots of reasons for that. I would love to chat about that, but I won't go into all those details. Our approach, oops, I think I'm just trying to go down. There we go. So for our approach is we didn't want to boil the ocean. The barriers that are preventing young Canadians from voting are pretty high. A lot of them are that the folks who are communicating with them about voting are not trusted people. They're politicians who really start talking to them before the election. And to increase just all young Canadians voting, it's not possible, especially for an organization our size. So we thought, where can we focus our efforts? So in the short term, we can get as many young Canadians into the electoral process, into the civic process, advocating for their issues. And then long term, this will ultimately have a positive feedback loop to get more people involved. So if you look at the demographic of Canada, there's around 40 ridings that have historically been decided by really small vote margins in a close election that have 10,000 or more students that go to school in that riding. So this isn't, U of T or McGill or UBC or Ryerson. This is like Georgian College in Barrie, Orillia, Springwater, Medante. It's Georgian College is about an hour and a half north of Toronto. It's suburban, rural, ex-urban communities where there isn't a ton of civic engagement or resources to get these students out to vote. 2 things we capitalized on is, one, students can decide if they want to vote at their home riding or their school riding. So we're able to educate young Canadians about which riding is more competitive and how in a first past the post system, there are some realities about not every vote counts as much as we would like. And then the other thing is that there were 5 days of on-campus voting. So literally you'd have tens of thousands, 10,000 or more people for 5 days walking within 50 meters of a polling location, and 9 out of 10 of those people care about climate change. Our work was really to get as many of those people to vote as possible, because most of them weren't going to vote unless we had a conversation with these people. So here's what we did. Here was our election plan from March to June. We started doing hiring. We ended up hiring 23 organizers who started in August at a week-long organizing boot camp. We had over 300 people apply. These were mainly folks who are recent graduates from university or college. We had one person who decided to take the semester off to work with us, which was fun. My parents would have killed me, but would have been what I wanted to do as a university student. We ran a week-long organizing boot camp in Toronto where we did trainings on recruitment, which I'll talk a lot about, leadership development, communicating with the media, using digital tools, and then how to manage a paid canvas operation. In September, the organizers who we trained spent every single day canvassing. So we did deep canvassing, which I'll talk about more, class wraps or class presentations, building volunteer teams where in every single interaction, they talk to about 15 folks an hour. I'll get more into that later, but they pretty much spent all day canvassing, texting folks in the evening, and asking those people to show up for volunteer shifts the next day. All of this was building up to, in October, from October 5th to 9th, this is when there was these 5 days of on-campus voting. We started hiring as many of the students as we could who were volunteers on the campaign and their friends to work 10 to 15-hour shifts during these 5 days, where they would literally go, "Hey, have you voted yet? No. let me walk you to the polls. Let me give you information about all of the parties' positions on climate change. And then here's information on which parties are likely to be competitive. So we weren't telling anyone who to vote for. We weren't telling anyone which riding to vote for, but we were simply just educating young Canadians on here are the positions of all of the different parties. And there is a trade-off in Canadian democracy where you're in this unique opportunity where you can vote in your home riding or you can vote in the riding where you go to school. And if it's competitive, you're much more likely to catch the attentions of the politicians who are running for office in your riding, in the more competitive riding. Let me go to the next slide. I can scroll down. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some of the results, and then after that, I'm gonna spend some time talking about two of the tactics that we had. So all in all, we ended up spending around 4,200 hours over 5 days. So that was almost 400 paid canvassers, literally walking students to the polls all day long. In some cases, we formed massive queues. So that was really exciting. In 4 of the places, we turned out more students to vote than the riding was decided by. So those are on the right. So that's Fredericton, Peterborough-Kawartha, Kitchener-Conestoga, and Niagara Center. You can picture in some of these places, we just had 30 canvassers working 15 hours a week, and it was a pretty big canvas operation. Every single person we walked to the polls, we asked them to fill out a form on their phone so that we could collect their contact information, and every person we canvassed, we did that during September. So we built a list of 44,000 folks doing that. We had approximately just less than 800 volunteers. And then a total surprise for us is that this number is actually a little outdated. We had close to 40 stories in the national news. So over here on the right, we were the front page of the Sunday Star. We had a feature article in the Globe and Mail, and we were on CTV, CBC, and Global News almost every day, all with the message that young Canadians are the largest voting bloc and that our top priority is action on climate change. So we were able to reach a much broader audience because of our message. Okay, what I would love to do, here's some tactics, is talk about some tactics that were impactful for us, and then I'll wrap up. The ones I'm going to focus on specifically were the deep canvassing, peer-to-peer text messaging that we used in the paid canvas. So one of the obstacles that we were facing is that if you're a young Canadian, you probably are going like, I took civics or social studies. That's really like it's the most poorly rated class learned in high school. And so you don't have a good understanding or motivational aspect of learning about civics. In most families, your parents aren't talking about politics at the dinner table, and your peers aren't. And then the people who are fundamentally talking to you about politics are politicians who are not spending a ton of time talking to young Canadians, and it's this negative feedback loop because we don't vote. So our approach with deep canvassing was, part of it was to educate young Canadians, and the other part was to quickly move them into taking action and contexting the action on the issues they cared about. So what our organizers would do, and then very quickly, it was lots of volunteers on each campus, is they'd have a clipboard and with a QR code on the clipboard, and they would literally spend most of the day just circulating, going from table to table in the cafeterias at the campuses or in public places going, hey, can I join you? And students would be like, okay, but because there was another young person, there was an initial level of trust of someone approaching them. And then rather than saying, let me tell you the spiel and why you should vote, they'd start off by asking some basic questions to get to know these students better, like, what are you studying? Where are you from? You know, other basic questions. I'm blanking because I'm nervous and doing some, public speaking of some sort. But ultimately, they would start off by going, do you feel that our country's leaders and politicians are listening to you? And the answer would be no. The next question we would ask them open-ended questions. Why don't you feel listened to? Would be an example of a follow-up. The next question we would ask is, who do you feel that our leaders and politicians are listening to? And what was amazing is that across like 80, 90% of students, they'd say elites in the cities. You have to remember that most of these folks were suburban or rural or exurban. They'd say big corporations, and then they would just talk about older generations as the third. And then the last thing that we would ask before we would context the work is we'd say, what are some of the issues that are facing you? Often they wouldn't know exactly what to say. So we'd say, what are your concerns? What are the problems that you're reading about or speaking about with friends? And typically this was climate action was a big one, which wasn't a surprise given the strikes that took place in the fall. Another one was just around affordability. So in Ontario, the OSAP cuts were a big issue, but just the rising cost of living and especially around housing. And a third was access to mental health services. And this often doesn't come up in polling because you have some stranger calling you, but when you have another young Canadian who's asking you open-ended questions, people often would say, I feel quite isolated, I feel anxious, I can feel lonely, and folks would say that to folks. And then only after we'd had that conversation with people where we'd had an understanding of what they would care about, we'd say like, cool, let me tell you what we're all about. That problem that you mentioned. So if they said climate change, we'd say, climate change is up for grabs this election. We can start addressing this problem. The riding where you go to school and can vote is going to be decided by maybe 1,000 votes if it's a close election, and more than 10,000 students go to school here. So what I need you to do right now is take out your phone, and if you'll notice in the photo, they scan the QR code that we had on these clipboards, because one, it let me track, our managers track how many folks people were talking to in real time. And then two, because it was on the student's phone, they had their user profile saved in their browser, and it would automatically autocomplete their phone number, their name, their email, and their postal code. So we got close to perfect information. I think we had a 97% correct phone and email rate from everyone that we talked to, and it sent in a text message to them immediately. So if folks later want to go to futuremajority.ca and there's a join button somewhere, and when you sign up, you'll see that you'll immediately get a text message from us. So we immediately set the expectation that we were going to be having a text message conversation back and forth with folks. So that was the deep canvassing that we had. And the other thing that we used was just peer-to-peer texting. So we built our own tool, which let us do a broadcast text message, which is doing, the way that you would send a message to a group of people, but we could merge in their first name so it was personalized. But then when they responded back in the mobile app that we developed, people could have a one-on-one conversation back and forth. So the way that this was augmented with our canvassing is an organizer would canvass for 8 to 10 hours every day. They averaged around 15 people that they would sign up in an hour with correct contact information. So at the end of the day, you could have over 100 people, easily over 100 people to text. We text every single person saying, hey, great meeting you today. There's a volunteer shift tomorrow. Can you show up? And then a percentage of these folks would say yes. Around 15% of these folks with our top organizers would say yes. And then half of those people would show up to a shift the next day to help canvass. So it really made it easy for us to start plugging students in and build volunteer teams really quickly. Just for time's sake, I'll talk a teeny bit about the paid canvas operation that we did. Pretty much we hired students. We did a few hours of training with them on how to flag students down and practicing the scripts. And then we shifted them in from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. to be on campuses, to either rove around campus to find students who are just lounging around, or to hang outside of areas that had high traffic going, hey, have you voted yet? Or, hey, do you care about climate change? Do you care about whatever? And then literally they'd say yes. We'd be like, great, I'm going to walk you to the polls and tell you about what's going on this election. And we would have folks, we gave folks a microsite that educated people on these issues. I am seeing a chat question okay, so I'm not going to read that. So I'm going to stop right there. Happy to answer any questions that folks have. But I think the things to just summarize are, we focused on youth because we're young people who are working at the organization. There's this really, really cost-effective way to turn out people who care about climate change in places where we could make a really big impact by just getting a few thousand people to vote in each riding. And then we use deep canvassing and peer-to-peer text messaging as a really effective way to meet people where they're at in person, and then using technology to scale the outreach to recruit more volunteers into the campaign.
That's so cool, Aaron. Thank you very much. Okay, so if you do have questions for Aaron, feel free to post them in the chat or in the Q&A panel down at the bottom. Next, we will hear from Ari, who is going to talk about the 100 debates for the environment.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. I think my internet connection is semi-stable, so I just wanted to say hi in person. I'll cut my video now and then endeavor to efficiently get the slide deck up. Just one sec. Video. All right. Can you guys hear me and see see the thing?
Yes.
Yep, looks great.
Brilliant. Alrighty. So, like I said, it's great to be here. Like Aaron, I also am coughing and wheezing and all that stuff. So I suppose say that this presentation is partly made possible by Tylenol, cold and flu. Over the course of the next couple moments, I'll talk a little bit about GreenPAC, about 100 debates on the environment, discuss the project in some more details, the challenges, lessons learned, and lastly, talk about outcomes and what we see next on the horizon. So about GreenPAC, just quickly, it was founded in 2015 with a simple mission of building political leadership on the environment. There are kind of three key program areas. One, political endorsements, where we pick the greenest candidates to support an election. Two is the parliamentary internship program, where we place environmental leaders in MPs' offices. And third, 100 debates on the environment. GreenPAC takes the view that big complex environmental issues don't get solved without without government, and we need political leadership to make that happen, to solve those challenges. So simple support for the environment doesn't equate to action, which means our focus is building literacy and ambition amongst the political leadership to actually, when it comes to 100 debates, the idea was really born out of necessity. For years, elected officials and opponents, we needed to make the environment an issue that no politician or party could ignore by getting as many candidates on the record on the environment as possible. We know there's broad support for environmental action, but we needed to create a base of power outside of political decision-making to break through that noise. And that meant building a politically relevant constituency for the environment and showing it to policymakers at our debates. We believe that doing so would not only make candidates more accountable for the environment and for their plans on it, but that if we could pull it off on a wide enough scale, it would create a national narrative about the importance of the environment that a new government would have to take seriously, or at least more seriously than they previously had. In terms of like the key tasks for this project, this is of course grossly simplified. I think it's important to make note of our mindset while thinking about this slide, which is that we were working on a project that really hadn't been done on this scale before in Canada. And we were working without a blueprint. We took the view that we were building the plane while we were flying it, and like absolutely took several wrong turns and had to do a bunch of wayfinding. But I think we're ultimately quite pleased with the results. You know, like this slide kind of gives the false impression that everything was done in like a very linear way. And you know, that is kind of how we'd originally envisioned it. But the reality was that this was all a bit of a jumble and that it all happened simultaneously. So like, you know, we would listen to feedback from our organizers, from experts, our regional leads, constantly update and improve the way that we would actually do recruitment or improve our materials or whatever it might be. So like the way we originally conceived of things, phase one was to recruit folks and to recruit organizers. We did that really leaning heavily on our connections within the environment movement. But we're like very pleasantly surprised to find a whole bunch of kind of like individuals that weren't part of organizations and that really hadn't done a lot of this stuff before, who had a lot of interest in, I suppose, taking on activism in a way that was new to them. And I would say that was probably one of the more kind of like personally gratifying aspects of the project, was kind of like walking folks up this kind of like ladder of leadership from, oh my God, I've never done anything like this before, to, hey, I can put on a whole event with MPs and I can talk to them and I can like get a moderator, do all this stuff. So that was pretty cool. Building out the materials that our organizers would use as a bit of a guide to put on the debates, I think was really critical. And I thought we did a decent job of doing that. But again, like, it was only strengthened by hearing the feedback from the organizers who said, like, what on earth does this thing mean? And we would have to go back to the drawing board and try to find a way to more clearly explain stuff. We did a lot of coaching and webinars, given the kind of like dispersed nature of things, and that we didn't have regional organizers at the end of the project, really. We had to rely on these kind of big group webinars. Some were more effective than others. Like at one point, we made the decision to stop doing big group introductions, which I thought was really nice for like movement and community building, but ended up taking forever. And I think people were busy with their days and they found it kind of trying. So in the end, that got cut. And yeah, I have to say, like, in practice, all these interactions informed how we did all these things. So it was all very cyclical. And then I suppose I just draw attention to that arrow on the bottom, which is like kind of a whole separate work stream of things that, like, dealing with the unexpected when the government makes a decision around putting a debate on the same day that we had planned all of our debates to happen. Like, that ended up taking, weeks of our time to kind of like nimbly problem solve and like crisis manage. And then, dealing with media is like something that our organizers did a lot of with our help, but coming up with like a national media plan. So they're almost like two independent but related work streams that happened here. In terms of some of the challenges and lessons learned, I think because a project like this hadn't happened on this scale, it was really difficult to get upfront funding. And as we moved, I don't know, like along in it, and it seemed more likely that we were going to be successful, we ended up getting a bunch more funding. And I think that had we been able to offer our organizers, who we were really asking a lot of, like a small stipend up front, there would have likely been more organizers, and there would have likely been more debates. I mean, a lot of people, paid out of pocket to rent out halls in cases where they weren't donated, for example. And so, yeah, that would have absolutely been helpful. Having an external comms person, also a function of funding, would have been really helpful. It would have freed up, other core staff to do different things, of course. We got sideswiped by a couple government decisions that were really challenging. I'd mentioned earlier this issue about the debate day. All of our debates were supposed to be on October 7th originally. This is like 100 debates coordinated across the country. And, most of them had a venue already, and moderators and candidates had been called. And then the Leaders Debates Commission said they're going to have their debate on the same day. So this meant going back to our organizers and saying, you know, all that hard work you did, we have to redo it. Hopefully you're all right with that. And that was, you know, incredibly difficult. We lost a lot of debates when that happened. And I mean, I'm honestly not sure how we could have done it differently. We made the decision, I think, to ensure that we couldn't change the government's mind before making that known to our organizers. Well, you know, while kind of indicating that it was a possibility. And perhaps we could have, you know, mentioned that earlier. I'm not really sure, honestly. The second decision that was really trying was around the People's Party. At first, they weren't going to be, invited to the leaders' debates, and eventually that changed, which caused a lot of consternation within our organizing efforts because, well, for a lot of probably self-evident reasons. For a while, there were about 3 people functionally managing or coordinating the efforts of like nearly 100 organizers. We ended up getting GreenPack interns to act as regional leads. And once that happened, you know, it really freed us up, like that core team who had been working on it for the longest to do other things. So again, like upfront funding and getting people, having the capacity to hire people to regionally organize and regionally coordinate was like a real game changer for us, and supported through the process. In terms of our partners, like we really leaned on a lot of folks within our sector. You know, probably many of you guys on the call potentially helped us find organizers who would be interested in doing such a thing, like working with us. You know, I think that we probably could have stayed in touch and like in touch better with some of our partners, and you know, thought about how to kind of like deepen engagement with them and stay engaged in different aspects of it. There was one challenge around like website signups versus Facebook signups, which I really still feel like unresolved on. People were far more likely to sign up via Facebook, in particular during our ad push, than they were our website. However, we needed to build and want to build out a list so that we could stay in touch with people, and Facebook doesn't allow for that easily. So there's this kind of tension there that I still feel unresolved on. And maybe I'll just go quickly because I'm conscious of time now. In terms of candidate engagement, there's this weird kind of chicken and egg problem where our organizers felt reluctant to reach out to political candidates to say, show up to my event. And they were also reluctant to create the infrastructure for their event without first having the candidates confirmed. Book a room, which is understandable, without having all the candidates say, I'll be there, but the candidates needed to hear this thing is actually happening before they would agree to challenge. And I think having been successful this time by having lots of candidates show up, and I'll get into the numbers in a moment, we're like probably able, if we were to do this again, say like, look, you just have to confirm event details and start promoting it at the earliest stage possible, and the candidates will ultimately come. And the very last thing when it comes to this slide is like, you know, we initially wanted to create a national media wave, and we were, I'd say, semi-successful in getting national media attention. We were featured in a lot of the, the national major papers, and I think covered on CTV. But the real thing for us was that what we learned, I should say, is that like having a nationally, a relevant project with local ties was just kind of like I don't know, like catnip for low in a way that I like kind of expected but didn't anticipate on that same scale. And so that was really cool. In terms of our key metrics, we ended up having 104 debates in total. Those debates were attended by 411 candidates. 87 of those candidates that showed up are now members of parliament, and several are in cabinet, which we're really proud of. I was actually shocked that over 16,000 people attended the debates nationwide, and we got over 550 news hits. And other validators, right? So there's a ton of social media chatter from people who attended the debates themselves. An idea I had following this was to print out little cards and put them on the desks of the debates so that the candidates would be encouraged to tweet, you know, something with like a hashtag or something. And, you know, like Melanie Jolie, here, Catherine McKenna or Justin Trudeau retweeted her tweet. So lots of validators in that respect. There was a lot of support from MPs themselves who gave us nice quotes, such as this one from Michael Chong. And then our organizers themselves in like really kind of large quantities indicated support for it. You know, many of them indicated that it was a really difficult thing to do, but that they were proud of the work they did, and that they'd be happy to do it again, which leads us to the kind of like 2.0 version of the project, something everyday advocates. It like stems from this idea that movement of people who are really interested in engaging, and that, you know, said that they'd be really keen to do this type of work again, but many of them still feel really uncomfortable actually talking to their MPs, and like uncomfortable with the kind of mechanics of government. So for phase 2, we're thinking about, you know, building out, helping to like build capacity and like building out a curriculum that we would do our best to teach to organizers and to their friends, letting them know how they can best do advocacy. We're really well positioned to do that because our co-founder has been doing government relations for like ever, and is a bit of a whiz when it comes to that. We also want to kind of create a schedule of like advocacy moments where those organizers can try to make meetings with their MPs on whatever issue it is that they, you know, feel most passionate about. And we want to organize again. So we want to hold 100 town halls, where ideally those same organizers are saying to the MPs that got what you said during the debates, like how far have you come in being able to realize those objectives? And, you know, this is what we want ultimately. And the only other thing I would say about like the everyday advocates plan is that, you know, GreenPAC tends not to work, or I should say doesn't work on policy issues specifically. It's all about building leadership in the environmental sector. So our hope is that we can help build up that capacity and then connect our organizers with other groups who do take action on issues, and, you know, and see if there can be partnerships to help move the needle on those issues, to build like ambition and leadership at the local level, to help improve you know, that same ambition at the federal level within government, ideally in partnership with you know, groups within and throughout our sector. And I guess I would just say that, you know, the project that we did wouldn't have been possible without generous sponsorship from several groups, including Insurance Bureau of Canada, Ivy Foundation, Climate Communications Hub, CGN, and others. And without the advice and support of many of the folks on the you found this informative, and I would absolutely be pleased to answer any questions when the time comes. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ari. So we do have a few questions here in the chat, and we will get to them at the end. So we still need to hear from Catherine, but your list of acknowledgements reminded me that I forgot at the beginning to thank Amber and Environment Funders Canada, who have helped us put together this webinar series. So this is part of our fieldwork series, a webinar series that's sharing what's working and what's not in Canadian climate engagement practice. It's supported by the Clean Economy Fund and members of Environment Funders Canada. So thanks for the reminder to get that thank you in there. And now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine to talk about what Climate Action Network did in the lead up to the election.
Thanks so much, Tika. Yeah, and just echo the thanks of partners who are helping us make this webinar series happen, and so great to hear about those campaigns in more depth. So I'm going to keep our intervention relatively brief, just because I'm eager to get to questions, and I think it was particularly juicy to spend a lot of time on Future Majority and Green PAC's relatively novel tactics and interventions into this election. Climate Action Network Canada, we are of course a kind of movement-facing organization, and so our resources throughout the election were really committed to helping our membership of 120 organizations that come from a diversity of sectors, including the environmental movement, the labor movement, health groups, youth groups, faith groups. Most of you on the line will be familiar with the diversity of our members. And also helping our large network of allied organizations and, for instance, the international development and humanitarian sectors to think through their campaign interventions, because we know, of course, many organizations concerned about climate change were going to take advantage of the fact that climate was really top of mind for Canadians heading into voting season this year, to get some messages out to help Canadians understand what choices they were really grappling with if they were concerned about climate change while casting their ballot. So we wanted to make sure that those organizations had the resources that they needed to understand the landscape they were working in, to navigate the Elections Canada Act, to navigate the intersections between the Elections Act and the CRA rules around guidelines around charitable action in political interventions, and we also wanted to provide a platform, as we always do, for kind of shared strategizing and communications development. So I'm going to share my screen and just pop up a couple of images from our annual report this year from Climate Action Network Canada, just so we have some visuals to work from. And I'll give just a rundown of the many activities that we focused on for election season. And then we'll dive into questions. I'm going to pop off my video for this part of it. So we began fairly early on in the year. We knew that the election was coming, of course, and so by spring 2019, we were gathering our members in Toronto to have a conversation about what they really wanted to be focused on for the election. So what were the salient issues that they wanted to be pushing each of Canada's political parties to be considering as they develop their platforms? What were the issues our membership was most concerned with us in Climate Action Network Canada's Secretariat moving forward as we spoke with political parties? And I should make clear that we are a nonpartisan organization, and so we were reaching out to every one of Canada's federal political parties to encourage them to put climate action at the center of their platforms and to offer our recommendations as to the level of ambition that those platform commitments should be articulating in order to kind of back up the recommendations that we were making to political parties, and also to help Canadians who were trying to understand the current lay of the land when it comes to climate action in Canada. We produced a report called Getting Real About Canada's Climate Plan, which really did a quite sweeping overview of where Canada's action on climate change stands at the moment, and provided a series of concrete recommendations for how Canada's ambition on climate needed to be improved. We circulated that report to all of the parties and had detailed conversations with each of the parties during platform development in order to outline those recommendations if those parties were, of course, willing. We then issued a survey to each of the federal parties, kind of asking them whether they were going to be putting anything in their platforms related to these recommendations. So that report helped to form the background document for that survey that we sent to major political parties. And once we had the responses to that survey, we of course published them, and the results of the survey got fairly wide pickup in Canadian media. On this note that I mentioned at the beginning of my comments about wanting to support Canadian civil society actors in understanding and navigating elections laws, we partnered with our sister network, the Canadian Council for International Cooperation, which is another network of close to 100 or just over 100 organizations working across Canada, in this case on international development and humanitarian issues, but our membership has a fair amount of overlap. So we partnered with CCIC to host a webinar with legal experts that walked through the changes that had been introduced in the Canadian Election Act, and also provided some insight into the points of intersection with CRA guidelines around charitable status. So we, of course, are not able to provide legal expertise, but we were able to help our membership and our ally organizations understand what they were grappling with to perhaps inform their own legal, the guidance that they sought from legal experts themselves. So it helped them kind of formulate the questions that they needed to be asking. Some of you on the line may recall that there was also a moment where an Elections Canada official on a webinar describing some of the changes that had been made in the Canadian Election Act created some concern for organizations who were working on climate through the election, that mentioning climate change might be considered a partisan action, which of course thereby creates concern for charitable organizations. And when that happened, and several of our member organizations raised the alarm bell, which again got a fair amount of coverage in the media, we were there to immediately speak with Elections Canada officials, to touch base with CRA officials, and to host a kind of emergency call for our membership and allied organizations to clarify some of those rules. Unfortunately, we saw, because of some of the kind of administratively onerous changes that were made to the Elections Act that required a registration if spending was going to be over a certain amount, and because there was some concern over intersections with CRA guidance for charitable organizations, that indeed a number of our members, didn't necessarily feel that they were able to communicate in the election landscape as much as they otherwise would have. Not because they were afraid or intending to communicate about voting for one party over another. That is not the role of any organizations like ours that are predominantly nonpartisan, but because they felt concerned that even speaking about climate change in this election might land them in hot water. And this, of course, is the result of a legacy of civil society organizations in Canada, sometimes, having to grapple with other targeted efforts to question their compliance with charitable guidance in the past. So that did, unfortunately, from our perspective, have a bit of a chilling effect in some of our allied organizations' ability to speak up during the election. That was, of course, not a universal truth, and so many of our organizations were speaking up regularly. But because that was the case, we were able to then become a spokes organization for sometimes on behalf of our membership. So I'll just flip a few pages ahead to this media section here. This is our website or our annual report online on our website. So if you're curious about what the other pages are saying, go on and take a look. So we did wind up playing that spokes organization role. We were in the media nearly every day during the 6-week election period. We did register with Elections Canada, which was another kind of service we were able to provide to our membership. The media coverage was really quite ubiquitous, and from our perspective, in an election that really was one that was about arguments and mudslinging, we felt that climate consistently was the top policy issue that rose through the fray. And indeed, we and so many of our allied organizations were able to regularly appear in media talking about climate change. We saw a really significant boost in engagement in Climate Action Network interventions online, on Facebook and other social media. We were able to co-host several webinars with folks on the line here as well related to the election, and those were very well attended. And this moment prompted us to create a members portal for our member organizations to collaborate through and to share resources and communications strategies and tactics. And so that was also a really helpful prompt for us to develop this kind of new platform that will continue servicing our membership into the future. So I think perhaps something for us to take away from this experience with the election is I think climate is going to continue to be a top of mind priority for Canadians in the political sphere. Being able to support organizations that are thinking through how to talk to Canadians who are thinking about climate as a political issue, who are trying to understand what it means to cast your ballot for climate action, what it means to speak to members of different political parties about climate action. The fact that climate action is not a partisan issue, I think, was also a really key element of our election communications, to say it is necessary that Canadians from every political persuasion speak to the officials, speak to their elected officials and speak to folks that are running for government about this issue, and necessary that we speak to each other about climate change. So these were all really critical interventions, and it was, I think, very useful for us to be able to join hands with such a diversity of organizations in our membership and beyond to get that done. What we also learned, of course, is that many of our member organizations, and this is the case for us as Climate Action Network as well, are very busy and overwhelmed, and sometimes under-resourced or working with diminished capacity. And when there are kind of legal changes that are happening that we have to be cognizant of, it can be a bit of a barrier to organizations kind of engaging in the ways that they would otherwise choose to. And so being able to develop those resources to walk organizations through those changes was really valuable. and then to be able to identify those organizations that were able to take on some of those administrative burdens of, for instance, registering with Elections Canada, and the ways in which those organizations were able to reflect some of the priorities that were coming from organizations that might not be able to do that registration was really valuable as well. In the end, I think we probably made a huge leap in Canada during this election in the acknowledgement that climate change is indeed not a partisan issue, in the understanding that every political party in the future in Canada has to come up with a meaningful climate plan if they're hoping to win Canadians' trust. And I believe that the work of Future Majority and the ongoing work of Green PAC and many of our other organizations that ran campaigns throughout this election will continue to reinforce that conclusion. And I think we also realized that having that conversation in the media and resourcing Canadians to be able to have those conversations with each other is quite essential. So I hope that we continue to kind of reap the benefits of some of the lessons that we learned and some of the tactics that we developed throughout the election. And I'm going to stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much. So Amber has posted a number of questions in the chat, and they're all really great ones. So I'll read through a few of them. There's also a comment here from Laura that it's not a question, just a comment to Ari. So Laura Sachs says that we had to change our debate to not be an official Green PAC one after the Green PAC endorsement of one candidate. There was an issue with non-endorsed candidates claiming that the debate would be skewed, even though we said it would not be. So Ari, you can respond to that, I guess, if you'd like, but I'll read out some of the other questions. Yeah, go ahead, Ari.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to and would like to. I guess now is a good time, so I will. I would just say that I think this was an oversight on our part, probably a function of kind of like doing 10 million things at the same time, and it sucked totally for like a number of organizers, right? Like we the ridings in PEI that wanted to put on 100 debates events, and the endorsements happened, and that went down to 0. So like it sucked for individuals who got kind of caught up in that mess, and also for the project writ large. Even though I'm still happy that many of those debates went forward, just not with our banner. I think if I had to do it again, and this is the subject of ongoing discussion within the organization, but personally I'd say it would have been better to stagger the endorsements and the debates. So to have the debates first, and then to have the debates inform who Green PAC endorses, I think would have been a really effective way to be able to do both kind of like key pillars of our work without mucking things up for people. So thanks for your comment, and apologies. I'm sure I apologized at the time, and I apologize again for that.
Thanks for that, Ari. Okay, so here are a few questions for all of you. The first one, we've heard from other people working with youth audiences that texting is the best way to have peer-to-peer connections. For folks working in this audience, what's your sense of investment in texting versus other forms of social media? What would you consider in making decisions about what tool to use and when? A question for Ari specifically, what was your target audience for the events or volunteer recruitment? If it wasn't specific, do you have a sense of what demographic responded best to the call for organizing or the debate format? And then maybe we'll do one last one here from Amber. It's again for Ari. If you had to choose, what were one or two things that got bummed in seats into the debate? Was it social media or local networks or what? Okay, so Ari, why don't you lead those ones off, and then we'll see if Aaron or Kat have any comments about texting and other forms of social media for connection.
Right, so suppose the first question for me in particular was about like target audience and all that stuff. Honestly, I think we weren't that like I don't know how to put it, choosy, I guess is a way to put it. Like we needed to get bums into the seats, so that politicians would see the power of people who give a crap about this, and it really didn't matter who those people were. Like all and anyone was welcome. It's the reason we really stressed that they were family-friendly affairs. And then I think in terms of the organizers that we sought out, probably it's more of a function of our networks, but we tried to find people who were already engaged in environmental issues one way or another, or who felt strongly about the environment. It's like 100 sounds like a huge number when you think about it in terms of debates, but like compared to, if you think about it in terms of like just organizing generally, it's actually not that many people, right? Like Aaron and Future Majority is kind of like case in point. So I think we're kind of looking for like a relatively small number of people who are willing to go deep with us, in terms of our organizers. But like, we weren't, we would say no to no one, provided they were willing to, sign on to some key principles, just key organizing principles that we had about it being, open and inclusive, nonpartisan, and that sort of thing. I hope that answers the question. And I'll answer the last one more succinctly, which is around, what were the key things that got bums into the seats? Yeah, the two things that Amber mentioned, social media, local networks, absolutely. But I think there was just like a global zeitgeist at the time. And I mean, I like hazard to say that maybe we just got a bit lucky, but like we existed in an echo chamber, along with everyone else's hard work on the call and what was going on with like the climate strike and everything else. So like, I kind of think it was the right time. And I think that global zeitgeist really helped motivate people who might otherwise have stayed home.
Aaron or Catherine, any thoughts on social media use?
Yep.
Texting? Yep.
I think it depends on the audience. Our analysis was that if you're like really plugged into climate change and you're following, like you're probably already going to vote, and us running like a couple ads or posting some social media stuff to on these folks was not going to be what's going to motivate someone to vote who wasn't going to already. And that you probably, you weren't, if you were an uninformed voter, running like a few ads, like there's so much going on in social media and there's so much noise, and it's particularly expensive during the election. Like reaching someone through social media isn't going to inform that voter about the party's position or the relationship between democratic participation and climate change. So, I'm not a social media person, but our analysis during the election was that there, like for the audience we were trying to reach out to, which were unlikely voters who needed no persuasion and simply doing turnout, it's like the marginal returns were low for running a lot of money on social media versus face-to-face conversations as being the focal point, and then really using texting as a way to recruit. We used it to do geo to get out the vote, but it was ultimately like face-to-face walking people to the polls was our turnout approach.
And Kat, any thoughts from you on the use of social media?
I mean, we're definitely not the social media experts, but I will say that so a big part of the challenge for us was trying to help Canadians who were going to cast their vote on climate change navigate the different climate platforms that they had available to them. So I think it's a useful insight, Aaron, that folks who were already going to vote for climate wouldn't necessarily, be persuaded one way or another by a social media ad. But if there's a person who wants to cast their ballot for climate and doesn't necessarily know what the relative merits of one climate platform is versus another, helping to provide a kind of baseline, which is what we were trying to do with our Getting Real About a Canadian Climate Plan report and with the survey, that indicated what levels of ambition would be necessary for climate action to be real in Canada was really useful. And those were the things that we got the most pickup on social media. So it was like helping folks who, yes, had already decided that this was an issue they cared about, figure out what they needed to do when they were assessing various parties' platforms. And then I also made my first TikTok, my first and only really TikTok video. And that was quite fun and seemed to, got a little bit of circulation.
And that makes total sense to me. I think we were working with like a pretty apolitical audience but I could see for folks who want to distinguish and make those choices, it being powerful.
Okay, there is a question here. Several recent projects that include projects done by people here have noticed the lack of civil engagement, education, or understanding of the political system amongst youth, but also at large. What do you think, wish, or wonder we could do to address that gap? And then finally, a question about media coverage. So all three organizations garnered significant media coverage during the election lead up. Did you have specific media objectives in mind, or what impact did you see from media coverage you earned? And while the panelists are responding, I'm going to post a link to a short article on the impacts of the Elections Canada rules for third-party advertising. So John Cameron was one of the presenters on the webinar that Catherine referenced that we did with our friends at CCIC, and he wrote some follow-up analysis. So I'm just going to share that in the chat. But go ahead, Erin, since you're the one that I see on my screen here, why don't you start?
Sure, I can talk more. I'll let other folks talk about the media, or folks can talk about whatever they want. I think ultimately, I've had like hundreds of conversations with youth who are like going like, yeah, I'm not going to vote. And I think it really starts with our education, where folks are going like, you should vote because it's your civic obligation. And when you have politicians who aren't listening to you, and there's scandals, and they're actively doing things that undermine your future, and they're corrupt, and they're virtue signaling, and then not actually doing those things, it makes it really hard to go, oh yeah, this is all about feeling good and my civic obligation. You're going like, wow, I'm getting spent hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent on people like me to think that like conscientious consumerism is actually the right way to go about doing it. And I just think that the message that we should be educating people about is, obviously our civics curriculum isn't going to talk about power, but talk about the relationship between voting and the issues that you care about in your life and having your voices heard. And my experience going through the Ontario civics curriculum and speaking to people is young people who we talk to have no understanding. They don't have no understanding. There's a real obfuscated understanding between the relationship between them voting, them speaking to a member of parliament, being organized formally in politics, and actually how cities just being playgrounds for the rich, or the climate crisis, or affordability, how those two are related. And I think that anything that we can do to do that and then build power, but now I'm just ranting. That's it.
Okay. Kat, do you want to share something about our media objectives and impact and all that? We had a lot of media coverage during the election, so.
Yes, we had a tremendous amount of media coverage, which was, so I think like what I was kind of trying to get to this in my comments. I actually think that this moment helped us to like go deeper than maybe we'd been able to go before when it comes to media coverage on climate change. So many of us who were being interviewed about climate during the election were able to speak about policy in pretty nuanced terms, to speak about the interactions between different kinds of policies, the relative merits of some policies over others, to speak about Canada's role in the world, right? To contextualize this election in what it meant, not just for Canadians, but also for the global citizenry that is really, desperate for and needing developed countries like Canada that are historically responsible for the problem of climate change and have a disproportionate amount of resources to be able to respond to the climate crisis to actually step up to the plate. It was really interesting to some of the media we did was actually on that note outside of Canada. So it was interesting to see the enthusiasm with which media outlets and audiences in other parts of the world were following this election because it was acknowledged as a climate election. You know, and then in the end, to be able to say in some of those follow-up interviews that yes, more than 60% of the Canadian electorate cast their ballots for parties that promised more ambition from Canada when it comes to climate change was pretty significant as well. Whether we actually see that followed through with is another question. So as always, this was only the beginning of our work. And I think we probably have a little bit of work cut out for us now in continuing to have those kinds of nuanced conversations in the public sphere about policy options. Because of course, a lot of climate coverage is linked to, unfortunately, climate disasters. And when we see emergencies like the coronavirus crop up, they very quickly consume any space for climate conversations when in fact this should be an indication that, you know, the coronavirus is and its impacts globally and economically are just yet another example of a kind of global system that we're living in that underpins climate change and is really not really working for people or the planet anymore. So, you know, so kind of using these moments to reinforce that message, I think, is important.
Great. And Ari, do you have any additional comments to add there? No. Did we? I wonder if we lost Ari.
Answer.
Oh no, there. Okay, sorry. Did you have any additional comments just on those last two questions about public civic engagement and helping people to understand the political system, or thoughts on media coverage? I think Ari's connection was problematic, so maybe we will just leave it there. I don't see any additional questions, so I think that's probably time. We're almost at our time anyhow. So thanks to all three of you very much for your wonderful presentations and all your thoughts on everything that happened in this very exciting past federal election. It was definitely one for the record books when it comes to climate. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Aaron and Ari. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.